Pierce Transit. I'd like to call this special meeting of Lakewood City Council for Monday, July 30th to order. Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Councilmember Branstetter. Here. Councilmember Simpson.
Here. Here. Volkey's here too.
Councilmember Barth. Mayor Anderson.
Here.
Councilmember Moss has been excused and Deputy Mayor Whalen is excused. You have a quorum.
Second traffic. We have one item of business, the review of the downtown sub-area plan. We have Mr. Buer and Ms. Spear for this.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of the City Council. Trying to figure out distance here.
I'm informed is a matter of point of order. I understand there are sandwiches. Is that correct? And where are they located? Pardon? Small books. Well.
That's all.
We have food. Well,
we're not recording any of this, are you, City Clerk?
Carry on, Mr.
Chaos reigned.
That's fine. We're here again tonight to talk about the sub-area plan for the downtown.
Could you say again with a little more oomph in your voice, not again? No.
I am pleased to report to the City Council that one more time we are going to talk about the downtown sub-area plan because we're also excited about it. And what I thought I would do is just run through the memo that's been provided to you and give you kind of a history as well as reviewing some of the questions that you guys had at the previous meeting. The first part of the memo really does talk about the sub-area plan introduction and where does this stuff come from under state law. And so we went ahead and provided you some of the information, which is the enabling legislation. It basically talks about mandatory elements as well as optional elements, which a sub-area plan is an optional element. And this is all through the Growth Management Act. On page 3 of your packet, it shows you a list of benefits to the sub-area plan process. You've seen these before, basically avoiding delays, avoiding costly technical studies, attempts to streamline review, avoid appeals under SEPA, and hopefully trying to inform the private developers that these are the rules of the road up front, and this is what the city is willing to invest in public infrastructure so they know where things are going. And then it also talks about transportation funding on page 5, and we're going to talk more about that a little bit more this evening, so I wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. Beginning also on page 5, we refer to James Guerrero's letter number 1, and then we provided responses. You'll note that on pages, I'll slow down. Also on July 23rd, the City Council discussed the downtown plan, the form-based code, this comprehensive plan amendment process, the planned action ordinance, transportation funding, and James Guerrero's comment letter. Then present, which is beginning on the bottom of page 5, you have James Guerrero's second comment letter. And there are basically two primary issues there. Going back to window transparencies and discussion about the open space process, dedication, in lieu fees, or impact fee. And under the window transparency section on pages 5 under responses, you see 3 dots. Those are possible amendments to the downtown plan to address Mr. Guerrero's comments. The city council, excuse me, city staff has no objection to that, but we wanted to make sure that you were aware what was being proposed and some minor changes. The letter also in the response talks at great length about the Puyallup Central Business District and their downtown plan, and tries to explain the difference between the two. There was also discussion on window transparencies, and again, we provided you some pictures to that effect. At the last meeting, there was also some discussion on civic uses. We reviewed those in the report on page 9, and it lists a variety. I think there's, 14 different types of civic uses listed on the top of page 9. And then also on the middle of the page, it indicates what civic uses would be accepted or prohibited from the plan. And those include military installations, postal services level 3, which is terminal processing facilities, which you normally find in industrial zones. Certain types of public maintenance facilities, public safety services, for example, correctional facilities, and transportation level 4 and 5, which includes taxis, shuttles, and bus barns and yards. Typically, we see those in service commercial zones or in industrial zones, which is where they are currently located in the city of Lakewood. And then it also refers to airports and heliports not being permitted in the downtown. And then on pages 10 through 13, we have provided you tip sheets. This is how someone would come in if they were proposing to do different types of development, whether it be new retail, mixed use, and so forth. It helps the developer go through the process. On page 14, we want to spend a little bit of time with you this evening on this, if that's okay, talking about how the transportation cost calculations work. And there are ways within this document whereby the developer, if he's having to put in his off-site improvements adjacent to his property, actually receives a reduction in his total fees to offset that portion. He still has to pay a portion, but he receives a benefit. So we wanted to share with the council how that works. Then on page 15 is a list of potential amendments to the packet to date. One is to amend the colonial district boundaries. Again, 2 refer within the downtown development code the definition of civic uses. Insert planned action transportation fees into the fee schedule. And then Exhibit D of the planned action ordinance would require that Lakewood refund any unused planned action shared transportation fees. Now, currently it says that you have to return the fees after 10 years. You don't have to do that. You can keep the fees longer if you want. So we'd like to have some discussion with the council on that. Renumbering the downtown plan to refer to it as Title 18B rather than including it in 18A. Amending Exhibit D of the Planned Action Ordinance to clarify that the Planned Action Shared Transportation fees will be incorporated into the city's master fee plan. And also amending Exhibit B to include some following text amendments, again, which these are found on page 15 that refer to the Institute of Transportation Engineers strip generation rates. These are documents that are found in the Public Works Department that we use all the time. And then lastly, the whole discussion, open space dedication requirements. What is the City Council's desire in that particular area? Well, that seems to be one area that I'm a little unsure about where the council wants to go, if at all. And then lastly, on pages 16, 17, 18, through 20, we have given you options as far as the overlay to the colonial district. There were some discussions that it was too big. So the first one that you see shows you what is proposed in red. That's the large version. And then you have you'll see a series of variations. Option 1 is the smallest version, which is predominantly the colonial district or the area of QFC and the Colonial Plaza properties across from Motor Avenue and Bridgeport Way and Gravity Lake Drive. It's basically 3 blocks. And then the other options, 2, 3, and 4, are variations on a theme to expand it either to the north or to the south. And then there needs to be some discussion with the city council how you wish to deal with the Harborstone Credit Union property, because they find themselves right in the middle of a major block. And since it's a brand new building, do we leave them in or leave them out? We've gone back and forth with internally and staff about what is the best way to handle this. As long as they're not proposing new development, they can stay there as is and nothing changes. And so we've given the council some options to consider. I won't go into any details at this point, and we'll go into the more detailed questions as you have them this evening. And with that, Mr. Mayor, I'll turn it back to the council and we'll open it up. And Tiffany's going to join me because she has some a little greater expertise in certain areas than I do.
Okay, refresh my memory. Where's Harborstone on this, on the base plan?
Triangular building right at the bottom.
Okay.
Another building just above that that's offset traffic.
It's two buildings here, Mr. Mayor.
Okay.
Then you see their parking lot, which is here, here, and here. Right at the slides.
So it's not included in options 1 or 2?
Pardon me?
It's not included then in options 1 and 2?
True. At the same time, it makes sense to see if you can create a block versus breaking it into pieces. One of the options is to focus on a portion of Gravity Lake Drive. Excluding certain others. This is the smallest version, option 1. And you have the USC, the Colonial Center here, Motor Avenue, and you have another Colonial Center property east. And then here is Eagles Plaza, Gravity Drive, Bridgeport Way. Go to option 2. What this one does, it keeps property up here to the north. Use this area again, all these areas. Includes this area on the west side of Gravity Lake Drive. And these parcels only, and it takes out those sections. So it's a funky little boundary. And oftentimes what we're trying to do is square it off, and that's how the original recommendation came forward. This also takes out the Gravity Lake Drive, the Google property right here.
So what properties south of Mount Tacoma Drive were part of the original, what was it, 1939 development? Any of them? Yeah, what south of Mount Tacoma Drive, if anything, was in part of the original 1939 development? So the original Colonial Center is limited basically to option 1.
Excuse me, can we go back? Yes, here we go. But the original did not include this either, Mr.
Right.
Mayor. So this is all subject to redevelopment in some form or fashion, seem like to make good sense to have.
Isn't the bank south of that then? Columbia Bank?
Columbia Bank is right here.
Right, south of the border, and it's the one that looks colonial.
Yes.
Yeah.
We have America's Credit Union over here.
Less colonial.
And then here's option 2. Option 3, again, is just trying to make it smaller and just adding property to the south. Option 4 basically takes out this area only and keeps everything else in. So you have a variety of different proposals there for you. If you're trying to make it smaller, going back to option 1.
So what advantages to the city are there to having buildings that are not colonial in nature deemed to be in a colonial district for design purposes?
Once they were to pull a permit in the future, then they would have to be complying either in part or in whole to the code. So over time,
I understand that, but what's the advantage to the city to that?
It's trying to create some sort of historical element, like what's past,
That doesn't presently exist.
that has waned in years, yes.
Well, I'm distinguishing between what was part of the original, I call it semi-historical, maybe it's classic as opposed to antique, Norton Clap development. And I can see from a preservation standpoint, preserving something or bringing it back. But if the boundary's expanding, you're telling people in other areas to create something that's historic.
No, can I ask the question?
Even on the Clap property, keep in mind that these properties at this end are not part of the original development. And that's fairly new. That's this building here on the side.
And that is,
That's currently was used at one time by Pierce Transit. And then I think it's currently being used as a church.
Mr. Simpson.
Just so I'm clear, if I was following what you were saying and my answer to your questions, I listened to this was it creates the historical creates a sense of place. Where I started to go off the rails is if we go further south, are all other future developments required to maintain a sense of that historicalness? And if the answer is yes, then doesn't that bring us back to the question that was asked last week about didn't we want to variegate or change this up a little bit? So when you said yes, I thought, well, wait a minute. I thought we were thinking about changing it up a little bit. Please clarify.
When you say changing it up a bit, are you referring to the entire boundaries of the plan or just this area?
Just this area, just to the type of development that occurs in that area.
There are some proposed amendments that would change it up a bit.
So now, to be clear, I'm talking about architectural, which is what I heard you referring to. That's what I'm referring to. We're talking about it doesn't all have to look like brick from 1850.
Correct. That's what the council is talking about.
Okay. Understood.
Those are some of the things that were being discussed by Mr. Barrow's first.
That's right.
So there was some suggested language to add that in, still maintaining this colonial style, but send people when to see for this.
Yeah, okay.
I think there's a advantage to the city, Mayor, of trying to create a destination locale for a specific type of businesses and things that are also consistent with Motor Avenue becoming a festival street in that area there, to where if it grows a little bit from the old Colonial Center, but it grows so that there is a uniqueness to the neighborhood that can help to make it a bit of a destination to look to be able to go and do that. So I think including one more block south along Gravelly Lake, between where Whitman would be in Gravelly Lake and then the other side of Gravelly Lake on the east side into this. I think shortening up the side on the west so that it really doesn't include all of this, but includes more of what the option one was, just adding that. But if I was going to add something to it, I would add to the west. that Motor Avenue actually runs one more block to Lexington. It's got the little church on the prairie on one side and a commercial building. If you go down a little bit down there, while there is one sort of multi-family residential complex that actually almost looks like it could fit in Colonial, and you go all the way down to Montrose where there's a triangle that's over here that is it's got the Alacoma Club and a commercial building on that small there. And that would be valuable to us because as we develop the Motor Avenue Festival Street, it allows that area to grow a little bit to the east. And while the right-of-way for Motor Avenue in that second and third block is not as wide as it is in the Whitman to Gravely Lake block, it's still a pretty good size piece of right-of-way, more so than on the average residential street, being able to go down there. And that would also be consistent with eventually wanting to make the entire length of Mount Tahoma Drive, which has that break in it of a block of Motor Avenue there, to become a pedestrian-friendly link deep into that neighborhood as far as the work there. So I would look to modify it that way by, adding this piece here, but also adding this way, those 2 blocks of Motor Avenue. And the buildings that are there are not the sort of buildings like those commercial buildings that are there are not the sort of commercial buildings that are going to stay around for a long time. They're buildings that could probably be motivated something to do that. I did have a question for Mr. Buer about when you take parts of it out of the Colonial Center, which parts do you put into the East District and which parts do you put into the Town Center District? Because the area, we got the 3 districts. When you shrink the Colonial District, we're still not shrinking the downtown. So the pieces that come out have to go into one of those 2, and if we expand the district that's got Lowe's and the post office further along 100th Street over there to, and a real question is, part of what we're taking out in almost every one of these is the current Goodwill property. And do we want that because it's on the end in a corner of the Green Street Loop? Do we want that to be part of the downtown district, or do we want it to be a part of the East Commercial District, which could move further along 100th Street and could take up the spaces down, any space that was further down Bridgeport to the north, if it is. So when we do that map, we got to look at where they are because we don't want to necessarily take things out.
Has anyone done an evaluation of what extra costs would be incurred by a developer to comply with the Colonial Center sub-regulations, I'll call that, or what detriment it might be to redevelopment? And the premise of my question is, we're in booming economic times, and without those restrictions, nobody's seen fit to redevelop those properties, and some of them sit vacant. So if we don't anticipate that there'll be any more robust economic time than we have now as far as building goes, and they won't build now, how do these regulations make it more likely that someone would develop the property? What would it cost them as an additional cost, if anything? And what is our target, since most of this is kind of naturally street level retail space and brick and mortar's going away?
Well, the last conversation, it would have been a week ago when Mr. Guerrero was here and speaking in person, or maybe it was 2 times ago when we actually had some of the consultants here. There was conversation about the brick development and the cost and why stucco would be a legitimate opportunity.
No, I'm talking about brick and mortar, as in stores, are going away.
No, I understand.
Not the brick.
I was trying to answer your question regarding using brick and colonial look and the additional cost there. There was conversation from all 3 of those parties saying that, yes, that would be, brick construction is more expensive. Mm-hmm. That's just a rule, and I want to say that one of them said it could be up to twice as much for the exterior. So that was part of the reason why you have now within the colonial district, whatever the boundaries may be, this idea that up to half of it could be stucco as opposed to brick. So now the question for the council is just where do you want it to apply?
Mr. Brennan.
I guess this follows up on the mayor's question too. Do we have any anecdotal evidence or feedback from some of the folks who attended these forums as to whether a sense of identity as being in the Colonial Center with whatever cost it might be for extra brick or whatever would be an added bonus for them to be an identifiable center that might have a greater sense of place? Does that have value for some of these folks, or was there much comment on that? Because you kind of wonder anecdotally around country, similarly sized cities where they've done this kind of thing, has it been a good investment to have an overlay like this, or do we get better bang out of our buck by actually doing the streetscape improvements and not worrying about what the design is? And what facilitates development better than not?
I would offer that the Colonial District is something that is a Lakewood choice. It's a look for this boundary that's under dispute right now. The idea that came from the developers forums were, we want to see a downtown, not so much we want to see a colonial district specifically. Right. And what the advantages for all of these districts is the SEPA done already, that sort of thing. So not specifically the colonial look.
Right. The other thing is, going back to Mr. Branstadter's comments, I have to say 2 things. If you do away with the pink, the light tan moves up. Right. If you change the boundaries, that becomes problematic, because everything that's been put together so far to date has been these boundaries. If you start changing the boundaries, then we're talking comprehensive plan amendments, zone change amendments, and some other things as well, if you're going into these areas. That doesn't mean you can't do it in the future, but if you were to do that now, we did not notice it, we did not describe this for inclusion of this area. So that becomes more of a problem than a solution, at least for the moment.
So you're speaking to expansion, not reduction?
Correct.
So reduction, since you notice a larger area, if you don't do anything in part of it, that's okay.
Right. But I want to be very clear in our description of the work that we're proposing. This was the boundary that we've been using all along. Doesn't mean you can't fix it or change it in the future, but for now, talking about this downtown plan, that's the boundary that we've been discussing. Going back to the whole issue of architecture, design, and so forth, the whole discussion has been focused on, for the most part, the Colonial Center, right, and that small little area. And if you listen to many of the residents of the city of Lakewood who lived here for a long time, that was the center of the universe for the city. Should the Colonial Center be larger or smaller? And we've got different perspectives on that.
Mr. Mayor.
Well, there is.
So,
Mr. Polkey.
Yeah, can I ask, what kinds of things, or how does the plan differ between the town center district and the colonial district? What are we looking for in the colonial district?
Really, the only difference is the facades, the look of the building. The same development costs, the same transportation requirements, the same review process happens. It's just, it's one more step that someone has to do within that area for the look of the structures.
And I think I'm talking about it, and I appreciate those remarks, but also kind of what types of businesses? Are we talking about the same kind of things?
Yes.
Storefront and then apartments above, okay.
Yeah. It can be purely commercial, it could be purely residential, or it could be mixed use, any of those.
So is the option available to incentivize the colonial center design aspect with respect to their permitting and impact fees, for lack of a better term, so that you say, we're going to put these additional restrictions on you within this area, but we're going to mitigate it because within this boundary, we aren't going to charge you as much.
That is within the council's prerogative, yes.
Mr. Mayor, if I may, I'll put my 2 cents in. I actually think that option 1, being much smaller, actually increases the chances of success than the other options, which are much larger. And I understand the nostalgia and the significance of the Colonial Center. We have really struggled, and there is construction going on, and it isn't going to look anything like the other buildings around there. I mean, I don't think the CVS is going to look the same at all. I don't know if they added any architectural features at all.
Yes, they did.
Oh, they did. Okay, good. So I actually think we increase our chances of success by keeping it within the boundaries pretty much of the original, which I think the number 1 comes very close to. I think in its current configuration, it's, you know, you're delving into areas, I think, that have already, in some cases, redeveloped or are in the process of, and I'll leave it at that.
Mr. Bransford.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, you know, I do think the Colonial Center concept is one of nostalgia. But as Ms. Spear points out, the difference when we talk about the Colonial District as opposed to the others is a matter of facades. And I think we could respect the history of the city and of the area if we just put those facade design standards along the Festival Street, along Motor Avenue, which would include the Colonial Center building that has been sustained most, appearing like it, has the theater, which is the poster child, if you will, for the Colonial Center, and the Terrace Restaurant, and is going to have, you know, our museum, and is going to then create a photographic, aesthetic backdrop for the kind of things that would go on in a festival street. And so that we maybe don't need a colonial district at all. What we need to do is have design standards for the one block of a festival street, which is in this plan, because that's the only festival street in the whole thing where we could use the colonial-like design standards.
Mr. Simpson.
I think I'm starting to follow this discussion fairly well, except for one thing. Seems to me it's always better to cast your net a little wider than to cast it small. And that's why I would argue or suggest or throw out for debate that we go with the larger options, because we can always pull back. We may not necessarily be able to expand if in the future expansion is required. And so I would say that using one of the larger options gives us a degree of flexibility that we might not have as we move through what I believe I heard was a 2-decade process. If we start small, in a sense, I think we stay small. But if we start large, we can always pull back into a smaller area if need be. Because again, my thinking here is, this is only a plan. It can be modified, but I think we have a tougher uphill modification if we start small, but it's a little more downhill if we start large and we have to come in small.
Mr. Whalen and Ms. Barth.
I'm at a bit of a loss because I don't have good information as to whether this would even be sellable. I mean, it's one thing for us to kind of make a pie in the sky, pronouncement from the ivory tower about, thou shalt have cupolas and white clapboard siding. It's another for people to be excited about. I don't like cupolas, but I gotta do the damn thing. It's gonna cost me an extra $3,000. I'd rather go south of the line and do something different. But if we're going to have an identifiable space, I don't mind option 1. And I don't mind, I think, what's called option 2. If I could look at the screen again. That has some, it's kind of a funky line. It has some sexiness to it because you do pull in the bank, to me. You've got a little bit of work there with some new parcels to be developed, right, where Dave is pointing. So there's some opportunity there for some tie-in to the Columbia Bank and then on down Mount Tacoma Drive and over to the natural Motor Avenue Plaza space. What's option 3 real quick, Dave? Let's take a look at that again.
Option 3 is just squaring off the boundary.
And I feel like better 1, better 2. I'm my eye doctor. Go back to 2 again. Let me look at 2 again. I know, it's crazy.
2 takes in parcels to the east.
Right, okay.
And here just so you have Bank of America, Taco Bell, Save-On Drug,
People's Plaza.
People's Plaza, right.
And Greater
What do you get
Lakeville.
north of that? Up when you're going Grapple Lake, you got a bunch of scrappy stuff going north,
Right, and
right?
then we get into the issues of single-family homes, and that's more of a difficult type of an issue, and we begin to change zoning here.
What's 3 again? Look at 3. That might be a little bit better from my perspective because it's a nice identifiable section. It's a little enlarged, like Mr. Simpson's indicating, might be preferable.
Well, and there's room for expansion there too.
Yeah, and there's some other people that can get to avail themselves maybe of some sort of credit, as the mayor indicated, if they wanted to develop the parcels south of the new donut shop and east, there may be some value to them to do that. So I'd be okay with option 3.
I guess my collective thoughts are that preservation of the identity of Colonial Center is good. I like free markets. I think if we impose a design standard on a limited area of the city that isn't getting development now, it's an additional cost. The developer looks at it and says, I'll look somewhere else. Why bother with that when someplace else doesn't have that? But if we limit the size, 1 or 3, and provide some sort of incentive with respect to the permitting fees, they can say, well, we have to comply with this, but it's incentivized. So that would, if I'm put myself in the developer mindset, that causes me to take a serious look at it.
Is there a tax abatement opportunity we can do other than fees?
One way of doing this
Yeah.
would be to say the split is 50-50. If we do development within
Right.
the Colonial Center, the split is not 50-50. Split might be something different where it might be 60-40.
Got it.
60% city and 40% developer.
That's not a bad idea.
Quick, easy way of providing the incentivization that the mayor's been talking about.
Because they'll use they'll get their pencils out
Right.
and say, okay, I have to do this. I have to negotiate this additional hurdle. I'm not necessarily opposed to the facade look of the building. I want function. I don't want to pay the extra cost, but if there's a credit there that kind of balances it out, or at least goes partway to doing that, I'll work it out. And it's not going to turn me away from the project at the very beginning. So I guess those are my collective thoughts.
What do you think about 3 versus 1?
I don't have a big objection to that. I like, on both 1 and 3, I like the fact that their shapes are more geometric rather than, a combination of trapezoids.
This kind of almost looks like New Hampshire anyway, so.
Either that or cartoon face. So.
That's fine. Fine. I like 3. So I heard 3 council members?
3.
4?
So my only
This way.
comment would be, I would not want to do anything, this is what I said to Jason, I wouldn't want to do anything to stifle a developer coming in and starting a project. And I think the more restrictions that we put on, that's going to happen. So I like the identifiable boundaries in number 3. It has room for, there's raw development down on the bottom there, and so there's opportunity. And I think if we encourage the opportunity with what the mayor's talking about as far as incentives, I think that's a good way to go.
Does the council mind staff exploring changing the transportation split?
I think that's a good idea.
That's a good, seems like a quantifiable, understandable way to do it.
I think in terms of development, within this area, the elephant is the QFC building.
Yes.
And the QFC property. And, not applying these design standards to those series of parcels. And granted, it's not a single parcel, so maybe there is some line, but we already got CVS, which isn't gonna look colonial. It isn't gonna apply to these standards.
It is.
Do we have?
What's there now certainly doesn't look like. I'm going to look at it. It's modern Russian embassies. And then back there, offset by is what is the value of the kinds of activities that we envision on the Festival Street to a developer, particularly to a mixed-use developer.
Mr. Bjorn.
A couple of things are going on. First of all, you have another rapid design big streets project that's underway, coming back, I think, for the report soon. Secondly, you have this downtown plan. Third, the current owner of the QFC is contemplating tearing it down, but hasn't made that decision yet. I'm hoping that if we could do a downtown plan, show the complete streets project, there's more of an emphasis to tear that building down and start over and do something different. There has been some discussion of a type of senior housing facility there that you've seen in quite a few University Place along the Bridgeport Way. So they're debating the numbers on that right now. So I'm hoping that what we're doing now will help pull the trigger to do something different with that old type building.
Yeah, that might be the catalyst. I wish we knew.
I'm also assuming that if they did a multifamily or that kind of senior housing, that we would probably give them a tax exemption too.
It's in the boundary.
If it qualified, as part to incent those kind of things. Okay, I can live with 3. I'm not crazy about 3. I mean, I think we're adding area in that doesn't have anything to do with the Colonial Center. And never has had anything to do with the Colonial Center, and some that's already been redeveloped, like Harbor Stone and whatnot, that they've already invested a lot of money. The American Credit Union place, which is brand new, where the chamber is. So I get that the bank building is. We also have that problem property right to the south of the bank building. So I think we should be aware of that. But I share the mayor's concerns about
And House of Donuts, which is probably the most iconic building in Lakewood, but it's not colonial.
It's mid-century, just the wrong century.
People now become a old donut shop.
As opposed
I don't know how we're gonna fit Tijuana Taco into
That was,
Did Tijuana Taco make it in option three?
No, it's just further south.
Okay. Do we have to write Knickers or somewhere Knickers in the district?
Tijuana was settled in the 1500s, so there's a link there. Next.
Is that the big issue?
Well, can I get one more question
Mr.
about that?
Mr. Ambassador.
Is that, you know, from our discussions, previous meetings and that, the idea of having colonial design standards is not quite the same as having design standards in the rest of the town center, which are almost kind of checklists, setbacks, open space, heights, things like that. And in most situations in communities where you have something like that, you know, there is a design board that is as a part of the approval process. You know, we don't have that in our plan, but I just also don't know that we have the architectural, or will continue to have the architectural expertise and the landscape expertise just on staff. And the plan calls for a downtown area advisory committee, but they're not with the authority or with a defined makeup of the skills necessary to sort of take a look at, both from a developer standpoint, an architect standpoint, and a community standpoint, to make sure that we're approving design things. And right now we're sort of in a staff mode. In most places, there would be a board of that sort that would be put together for particularly any area where the design standards are somewhat related to historical in specific architecture. And
wouldn't the point be to lessen the bureaucracy, though, so they don't have to go through a bunch of stuff that we would have to kind of pull off the
well,
shelf?
you know, I think though that if you're going to have an area that's like this, there is a point that deals with consistency. Okay, and you know, hearing about, well, it could be colonial, but it could look like, in other words, I think, you know, having a design review board that has which is actually the more common way that most cities would set up a design standards in a historical district, would be something that we would do if over time we want to do that. Particularly, I'm concerned about in Mr. Simpson's idea that if we start bigger and want to get smaller, I'm really concerned about the early developer who's out on an edge, who spends the money to be, you know, there needs to be some idea about doing it. And a board would have some flexibility, because you'd have an architect, you'd have a landscape guy, you have somebody with history, or we could give that authority to our current landmarks and historical board to say that they have some approval authority about development plans in this center. Wouldn't need another new board. We could give it to them, because they kind of have the right kind of makeup on it.
What's the town still can do? They've got a similar thing with their little downtown deal, where you have to go through and you have to meet the downtown requirements. It's still a historical district.
Yes, my experience with architecture review committees has not been a very pleasant one for staff or for the developer. It is often used as a tool to slow down development or increase construction costs, and you get into issues of arguing over color. I'll never forget the time that we spent weeks arguing over the color pink. the whole idea behind the issue here with the downtown plan, the Subarea plan, is to do everything administratively to keep costs down and also to make sure that these projects move forward appropriately. So the process is through an administrative review process. You do find that in the downtown district, beginning in 18A 35-100. That's a good question because I have different pages.
It's either, and I apologize, page 270
Or 260.
or 228. But it's within the Downtown Development Code itself, and it's at 1835A.240, are specifically the standards related to the colonial district.
I would just say, though, there is more to this than just build something as quickly as we can. You know, that you're going to have design standards, and you need to have a quality of where you've got some people with some expertise that are ensuring the quality of what you get.
So that's what I have two concerns in that regard. One is, just what you said, people with expertise, who have the appropriate expertise on the committee every time an application is made. The second one is, and I'm being truthful, not cynical, although it's going to sound very cynical. I think people who advocate for architectural review committees are people who've never been a party to a homeowners association. And they're fraught with lawsuits, and it's very problematic.
There is also, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, a appendix that goes with this document that provides an idea of the types of drawings and design elements that you'd see with the facade in a colonial district type project. You know, and off to the side here, Mr. Boki and I have also been talking about the fact that if you're building a very large project, trying to implement a colonial design into a large building could be a bit challenging. Not impossible, but it is a little bit different. And yes, I do think you're looking at increased costs with that kind of a design element.
Basically, this is going down to Lake Road, is that right?
Looks like it. It goes down to Mount Tacoma Drive. Oh, excuse me.
Lake Road, yeah.
Southern boundary.
Yeah, Lake Road. Okay, just come back. What's that street on the far east? What's our street going to the right there, Mike? Yeah. What is that street? Is that Bristol or whatever?
Bristol.
That's Harborstone.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And this would be Goodwill compound.
And this is the little Bristol.
That's Bristol.
There, Bristol doesn't go through, but that's the little piece of it.
So there's no street with that green line, is there?
No. So what you have is you have parking lots
Got it.
using it
Okay.
as a way of accessing the main streets. And over here you have a new apartment complex being proposed at this site.
Yeah.
And then you have several abatements being proposed down here. Once those abatements take place, I do expect to see redevelopment.
There will be if we ever get that stuff done. Bulldozer.
Yes, it is. We're working on it.
That's
Or
fine.
fire.
Yeah.
I'll be out of town.
I guess, you know, just a little bit on this. I would not be in favor of having another level of design review if we don't need it. I think that's the whole purpose of doing the standards. As I briefly read 18A 35-240. And as long as we have a good appendix in there with some examples for the developers to look at as they're taking the opportunity to do this, I'm hopeful that there could be some staff assistance to ensure consistency, and that's the whole purpose. I just don't know. I hear what you're saying, Mike, but I'm concerned about just another level of bureaucracy, especially disgruntled HOA architectural control committee members that found a new cause. I've litigated more of those than I need to.
Litigated and been the victim.
Yeah. So, yeah. And the sword and the shield.
Continue? Okay.
Big.
So this is really just informational, but as you'll see here on the left, those are the proposed boundaries as they sit for the entire downtown sub-area plan. It's the colonial district that you've been discussing, as well as town center, east commercial. And on the right-hand side, you'll see your current comprehensive plan map for that same geographic area, and the bright red is your central business district. So long story short, the extension south is the main difference in the geography there. But all of the central business district is included within what's proposed for your downtown boundary.
So is this part of the new comprehensive plan?
Yeah, this would be a change that would happen simultaneously.
So the NC2 zone goes away.
Yeah.
And it gets replaced with the central business district designation here. And then the MR2 zone, multi-family residential, also gets replaced as well. So you really increase development potential along these streets. And keep getting interesting reports about this area wanting to redevelop.
Oh, it will be. Yeah.
And this provides unique opportunities to address that.
Does that go all the way to the entrance to Nyanza today?
I'm sorry.
Is that to the entrance of Nyanza there to the far east or west? Excuse me.
That's Nyanza right here.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense to me.
And it's, where's Nyanza?
Nyanza is right here.
So it includes the apartments on the south side?
There's one apartment.
It also includes all of the properties south of this street here,
Yeah.
which is a good thing. That gives you more space to do stuff.
Yeah.
The concept map, I think you've seen.
So,
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go back.
Sure.
Why did we not include, the way I read the boundary, we've included Bridgeport Way in the entire length of it in downtown. But we didn't include the pink arterial commercial properties as a part of the downtown. So we've got the Bridgeport Way running through the downtown, then it's gonna run through an area of strip mall zoning, and then for 3 blocks, and then it's gonna go back to downtown zoning. You know, why not that commercial zoning there being, as on the south, being put in the downtown?
Mr. Master, are you referring to this piece here?
No,
Or
I'm
this piece in here?
This piece here.
Which piece, Mike? I couldn't see it.
59 down almost to 100 at that point.
This actually, the map on the left is a little outdated. We'll get one more version where what they've done now as a proposal is include Bridgeport Way itself. So you would have vegetation, landscaping, frontage improvements along Bridgeport Way for that one piece of the triangle where Mr. Buer is pointing. But the land use to the either side of that would still remain outside of the plan.
Okay.
So the look of Bridgeport is consistent all the way through that, but the zoning doesn't change.
But Bridgeport is, in other words, the right-of-way of Bridgeport is a part of the downtown.
Yes.
But the allowed uses,
The way we're down west.
the allowed uses in that arterial commercial thing is a very, very different type of thing. I mean, you could essentially at low-density strip mall type shops with parking in front of them. You know, and so, you know,
They're here.
whereas if you included those parcels to having to meet the design standards of the downtown,
Consistent.
you know, it would certainly create
It is here.
eventually a continuous use along Bridgeport in terms of an image of a downtown.
I think part of the answer, if I could, is again, the central business district current boundaries. But you were about to say something too.
No, my 2 cents.
Well, and during the public hearing process, that triangle between 59th and 100th, there were several property owners that were specifically here strongly expressing opposition to being included. So that was taken into account when the addition of Bridgeport Way itself was done, was to leave those areas alone per the public feedback that was received this spring. So that was all.
I would also say this entire area here, which is Oak Park Drive and over here in Seaweed Lake, this is a tough nut to crack. I have thought about this one for years about what to do. I mean, it just doesn't fit anywhere. Then you have a major arterial street that runs right through the middle of it. I also know that we have some very strong opinion property owners in this area who want to be left alone. I don't know exactly how to handle this, but now that's a truthful answer. I will say this. The city of Lakewood needs to take a look at its corridor commercial zoning, which I think is a separate issue from the downtown plan. And that includes this area as well as this entire area of Bridgeport Way, Stilichon Boulevard and long stretches, Custer Road. We need to go back and take a look at that at some future date because we have way too much commercial in the city of Lakewood. Not much I can say. That's another revisit and another zoning planning exercise at a future date. But for now, wasn't quite sure how to process this particular piece. And the fact of the matter is, if you're looking at redevelopment of this, you're talking about parcel assemblage to get a sufficient number of property to do anything. I didn't think that was going to be realistic. The other thing is our boundaries for this plan are already pretty large. And so, that was also taken into account with this whole proposal. So those are some of the reasons why that was left out. We have some very difficult land use and zoning questions. I'm not sure that is the appropriate time to look at this.
So
I would just say that the question, though, about that is that area in terms of what's the future use of that, the future of that eventually needs to be absorbed into the downtown. And parcels have to be accepted. It's no different than the two air corridor zones. They're in the same way. I mean, we're going to end up with a lot of non-conforming things to be able to go and do that. But in the air corridor, you said, the long term, it's got to change. And you should zone accordingly.
So I'll give you some historical perspective, some very similar housing. And I forget the name of the subdivision, but it was shipyard housing from World War II, where Costco is today. 30 years ago, from 38th Street, clear back to the annex on 35th, that whole area was small World War II worker housing that had a variety of restrictions on it. I was involved representing a real estate broker who was the agent for, I don't think the ultimate developer, but in property acquisition and aggregation. And that was private aggregation of housing that had very limited value, litigation involving the lifting of restrictions, and then a request for zoning change as they were going along. Say once they reached a critical mass on property aggregation, it required a zoning change. And what you see today is the redevelopment of something that's very similar, but the impetus for that was property value dropping to a point where it merited redevelopment. It wasn't a zoning change that spurred the redevelopment. It was someone who was well-heeled enough and patient enough to spend most of 10 years aggregating property.
You say to the council, there's no challenge, just say that. And I understand Mr. Grasser is Rebecca as well.
Well,
I'm sure I'm ready to chew on that one.
I would venture to say that if somebody had aggregated that property and had a reasonable proposal, I'd be jumping up and down and say, go for it. What kind of zoning change do you need?
So the concept map the council has seen before, but once more, you've got in pink what are called catalyst sites, so the areas where there is some additional incentive for getting additional height in particular, so more units, more density. You've got the green, which are the parks, the Central Park, and then the Green Street Loop and the Motor Avenue in particular. One more time, two maps here, and again, you've got the overlay districts shown, and then on the right-hand side are the proposed zoning changes, so this refers back to what we were just looking at. On the right-hand side, you see that everything becomes central business district other than that turquoise around the outer edge. That's the transitional overlay, meaning the step-down wedding cake that was discussed before, where there's less density and less height as you get close to adjacent, particularly residential properties outside the downtown area. We've talked about these options. I think what I'm gonna do is put like a toy soldier hat on the top, and you'll have a nose, and it'll even make sense with colonial. That'll be good. Yeah, okay.
It reminds me of something. Or Easter Island.
There you go, yeah, a tiki head, there you go. Then jumping ahead into some street discussions, this is the map, again, the same boundaries, but the yellow, the red, the green, the pink, the blue, and the orange are all different types of streets, and that's the basis for what gets zoned, what is regulated based on the street that you front. And so here, just what Mr. Brandsetter and Mr. Buer were just talking about, there you see Bridgeport extended all the way through as pink. You'll see the green street loop again. You'll see the red, either solid or dotted lines. The yellow dotted lines in the middle of the town center area are the ones that are being proposed to become public mixed-use streets. The red dotted is public retail streets. The solid red is the current retail street. And then the dark blue, those are low impact mixed use streets. So probably continuing to be residential, more so than strictly commercial. And then the Motor Avenue is its own festival street. So there's your different street patterns within the boundaries of the downtown. Starting to change toward transportation. On the left-hand side are your current, already included in your transportation improvement program projects within the downtown area. The right-hand side, these are all the proposed additional projects within the downtown area, and these are the basis for what's being suggested to be that planned action fee for transportation to be split at some amount between public and private sources. So Bridgeport Way, 100th Street, Gravelly Lake Boulevard, the Lakewood Town Center and Bristol Avenue becoming public, considering a potential roundabout, doing some bicycle improvements, and then new street connections for walkability. Up at the top of this next sheet, you'll see the total of all of those costs on the right-hand side, all those projects. The way it's been estimated in the downtown plan is almost $43 million. So I'm about to walk you through a couple of options here. Is it okay to proceed with the math part? Are we ready to go? Okay. The 50% planned action share, that is what was recommended to you by the Planning Commission, meaning 50% of the total cost for these projects would be covered by the private side, and then the other 50 by the public side. And that, of course, is grants or property taxes or motor vehicle license fees or whatever other source the council should ultimately decide to use. The 6658 number, that is under Planning Commission's recommended alternative 2. The total number of trips that right now, 21,481,000 would be divided among. And so a single PM peak hour trip, you'd take the 21 million plus, divide that by 6658, and you end up with a single trip costing $32.26. So the way the International Transportation Engineers math goes, a single family house is determined to be one single PM peak hour trip. Multi-unit apartment complex versus this office building versus industrial, they're all gonna have different number of trips during the PM peak hours, and so you'll end up with different totals depending on the type of project we're talking about. So if you look at that first example, 30-unit apartment complex, the math under that ITE standard is 19 trips. So then you would simply multiply the 3226 number by 19, and that's the number that they would pay. The 50,000 square foot office building, again, a different number of trips equals a different total amount to pay. So in that case, it goes up to 74 trips and the total 238,724. And then a general industrial, 10 PM peak hour trips, and that's standard rule of thumb with industrial. There tends to be lower employment within those buildings or businesses, so you have lower peak hour trips, so a lower cost. If you were to do a mixed-use development, the way this is set up is you would simply add the two types of uses or whatever, however many you have within a building together. So if you were to say a 20,000 square foot structure with retail space below, and let's just say, oh heck, 50 apartments above, I have no idea if that's realistic, you would simply do 54 trips plus 31 trips from each type of use there. That equals 85. You multiply that by your magic 3226 and you get your amount that you would pay for that mixed use development. Different example just below that, 10,000 square foot office space below with 10 townhouses above. You end up with a total of 20 trips in that example, so your planned action shares is 3226 times 20. One thing to remember is the benefit here for the applicant is that they are not having to prove this, do the traffic study, and figure this out. They can simply use that table. But one caveat you have below, and this would be the case whether or not there was a sub-area in place, they will be required under Lakewood Municipal Code Title 12 to do frontage improvements in any event. So this is where some of the credit that Mr. Brewer was talking about earlier this evening may come. If you have, and I'll just jump to the next example, a project, I'll walk through this in more detail, but if you have a project where at least part of or all of its frontage improvements are actually part of the plan that the city's gonna do for the downtown area, so in this case, we've got a project that would have one or possibly two sides of its lot included in the planned street improvements that the city would do, they don't have to pay for that twice. They're just gonna pay the one amount and their frontage improvements is credited against what they're doing because of their location. So this example, and again, when I started to show this to others internally, they immediately pointed out this is a terrible lot to choose because of what's on it right now, but let's just pretend. You have a proposed 30-unit townhouse at the northwest corner of Gravelly Lake Drive and Alpharetta. So pretend it's a blank lot at the moment, if you would. Based on the type of project, that's gonna translate into 16 peak hour trips, and so that's a total of 51,616 just for the planned action share. So again, their portion of those projects that are for the whole downtown area based on the number of trips that unit or that project would generate. Then you have their required frontage improvements in Title 12 and whatever other public works standards would apply in different manuals. And again, these are totally arbitrary numbers, they're probably completely wrong, but Gravelly Lake Drive, let's say they would have had to do $15,000 worth of improvements along Gravelly Lake and then $10,000 along Alpharetta, but that Alpharetta improvement is outside of the downtown plan. What you could end up with is instead of paying the 76 number, you subtract the Gravelly Lake 15,000 because otherwise they're paying for the same thing twice. And so they're down to the 61.6 number instead. And so it's just gonna be, depending on the lot, the type of use that it is, whether it's fully inside of the downtown area or partially inside, whether it's on a lot that is adjacent to more than one or just one of the streets that's proposed for improvement. This kind of math is done and they're able to figure out how much they're gonna be paying. So does that make sense?
Before we get too much farther into
Sure.
the weeds, because I'm lost already.
Okay.
What's the comparison of cost based on square footage of office versus retail versus residential? Because, what? Because a developer, when they're choosing the mix, is going to look at it and say, well, I've got to do mixed use, or I have to have retail on the floor. And they're going to decide what their footprint is and their mix based on profitability. And this is going to have an impact on that. So just if you have an average, say, okay, we're going to build out 1,200 square foot condos. If you have 10 1,200 square foot condos, so you got 12,000 feet. How's that compared to 12,000 feet of retail or 12,000 feet of office?
And I don't have that answer for you this evening. This is strictly the transportation dollars.
I know, but that's transportation engineers determining what they estimate the cost will be based on trips. What I want to know is what's going through a developer's mind when they decide to build that, because their economics are going to drive what they build.
Correct.
And it's going to be based on what the best mix is. And this is part of that. Some of those spaces cost more than others to build, but this is a variable cost that's going to go in the equation. And so we have some influence on, in developing our formula as to what we want to incentivize or de-incentivize, disincentivize.
What you're asking is what kind of square footage generates more trips? Which kind of square footage generates less trips, so that the same amount of square footage of housing is either more or less trips than the same amount of commercial?
Yeah, but true, I agree. That's part of it, but the other part of it is what, not just the trips, what that means in dollars when somebody's deciding what the mix in their building is going to be.
And I'm sorry, I guess the best answer I can give you right now, Mr. Mayor, is as you said, it's going to be site-specific. It's going to be the type of mix of uses that they decide, or if it's a single-use structure, what they're going to want to do in terms of improvements in the quality of the office space. Is it Class A, B, or C? Is it multifamily? Is it single-family? All of those things will tie into it, and a developer does. He looks at the bottom line and says, is this pencil or not?
But the part we have some control over is what those numbers are on the transportation side.
Transportation, and then in some cases, the parks, yeah. Yeah.
Mr. Brenstead.
So the numbers in that you gave us, though, are if a developer builds something in 2019 or 2020. Because it says that we're going to change the numbers every 2 years by changing the fee schedule to account for inflation in the costs of projects that aren't built yet, or I'm not really clear how we'll decide. We've got charts and things that essentially give us our 2018 base that'll apply to the fee schedule for 2019 and 2020 if we approve this. But then when we get to where we're creating the 2021-22 budget, I don't understand the methodology, because some of this infrastructure might have been built already at 2018 costs, but others will remain to be built, but the cost goes up. And so a developer in 2021 has got a different set of numbers. He may have the same number of trips. I don't know whether we're going to recalculate the estimate of trips, recalculate the cost of all the remaining transportation and improvement projects. What's the mechanics to where we're going to change the fee schedule every 2 years?
From my perspective, we would be taking a look at what capital investments the city has made let's look at, all right, we're going into a budget for 1920, so the next biennial budget would be 21-22. In 21-22, we would be taking a look at what level of improvements have been made through grants or other projects of that ilk where we were able to get state or federal funds or funds from PSRC to make some of these improvements. If those improvements are done with the grants, the total cost has gone down. So we would reflect that in the master fee schedule for 2021. And so that's the primary piece, is if there's been those kinds of improvements made, we would offset those projects with different numbers.
Okay. The way that the 50-50, which is at least a proposed number now, I don't think we've agreed on an actual number yet, but is that the city's 50-50 50 is not city money. The city's 50/50 is all those grants, other people's money, not ours. And so you'd have to get an awful lot of grants before you'd exceeded the 21 million in 2018 dollars before you would even begin to reduce the developer 50%.
I don't dispute that, but if that's the things that we would be looking at as far as changes in the numbers. Was the city successful in obtaining grants to reduce the money? The other issues would be, have costs gone up or down in relationship to construction? And most likely they're going to go up.
I guess that I'm concerned that the planned action ordinance doesn't spell out a process to do that recalculation. Are we going to use an established cost inflator there's a construction cost inflator out there that is an index that we're going to use that to increase the baseline number off of the 2018, or are we going to re-estimate every project and come up with a new number to define folks there to be able to go and do that? And that's I think we're trying to do this to provide for some predictability, but if we say the predictability is only there for 2 years and we could deal with the formula significantly differently, and how long are we going to grandfather in the trip estimates for different things over there? I mean, is that going to be stable, that a 30-unit apartment complex is going to be 19 p.m. peak hour trips? Is that going to be stable for 20 years? Or is that going to be re-looked at every 2 years and re-put into the formula based on another study or another set of data? I'm just trying to, we ought to define, we can't say that we know the exact how the numbers will change, but we ought to be able to say the process by which we're going to make the change. It's like we do for COLA increases for folks and things like that when we look at established indexes.
Mr. Branstetter, a couple of things. First of all, yes, the PM peak hour trips would be a constant because they are coming from the manual that the International Transportation Engineers developed. If that periodically changes and your Public Works Department is using a new version, maybe that would be the time to review your PM peak hour trip analysis. But otherwise, the number of trips coming from each types of use is going to stay the same. In terms of the changes to the cost of construction and what the fees might be, the way it's set up right now in the proposal is by adding this cost, the 3226 number, into your master fee schedule, that would be available to the council to change every 2 years if it wanted. And then there's also a periodic update of the overall plan. So if you end up coming back and saying after, I'll throw a number out, 5 years, and you've decided, you know what, we've only put one of these projects on our TIP and we're not going to actually do project X, then your total number of projects changes and everything else falls as a result. Or you come to a point where you've decided we want to incentivize inside the East Commercial District for whatever reason. The council could say, no longer do they do that 50-50 split or whatever you decide on, it's now a different split. So those are all things that can be done periodically by the council as this proposal is drafted right now. So hopefully that at least answered part of it.
Well, I guess it does. It shows that we have a lot of flexibility in each budget cycle to do things if we've got a basis to make changes. Difference between modified 1 and 2, as I recall, there was just a slight amount in the total transportation cost. But there was a significant difference in the number of projected trips. So that means that if we were to, and we could look at it in two ways, under 2, which is things will get to be everything we imagine. That actually, we imagine more trips, so that means that the cost to each developer is going to be less.
Correct.
Whereas, but it will also take us a lot more time to get the 42 million. And we may never get all of it. Whereas if we choose modified 1, which is more likely that we'll probably reach in 20 years, we would get all the money within the 20 years through this process. But the cost per trip is greater to developers. So it's a question of what's more important to us. Is it more important to have a greater certainty of getting the money within a 2-decade window? Or is it more important to keep the cost per trip down for developers?
Mr. Whalen.
Well, I think we have to go through this analysis, but I'll be honest, without feedback from the business community, I'm concerned when you get anyone to invest, having to do all the off-street improvements or off-site improvements, having to do this extra fee, having to accommodate new standards of construction and design potentially. I'm hoping that we'll get somebody to do anything within the next 20 years.
Yeah, Mike, concerned by it. I did some quick math on my question, and it seems like an office, if you take an average size apartment or condo, the office is going to be have 2.5 times the impact fee for transportation than residential will, and retail is going to have about 4 times the expense. And not only did I share some of Mr. Whalen's concerns, be careful what you ask for because you have unintended consequences. If we disincentivize office and retail to the benefit of residential, you're more likely to get residential. Residential uses tax money. Office and retail generates tax money. So if does that accomplish our goals of creating a more robust business climate and job creation in Lakewood, or are we actually incentivizing more bedroom community, which requires services but doesn't generate the tax dollars to cover those services? So it's part of a bigger picture.
I would just state, Mr. Mayor, that these fees would not be a new fee per se. They're simply pre-calculated, because if they were not included as part of the downtown plan adoption, these would be individually negotiated with every developer. So there would still be frontage improvements, and then if you decided we're going to do something along Gravelly Lake Drive as a city, you would be looking at potentially something like this. So it's not completely foreign to the development community, and yes, it's new for Lakewood, absolutely.
This replaces SEPA then?
Yes.
So we put in the street light, or they pay through this if we have to put in additional street light?
Correct.
Okay. I don't know, the list, the project list, and I see on page 81 of the June 2018 memo, is a bit ambitious, and I don't know that we've discussed every street and taking over every private street and that, I mean, that's how we get to that $43 million figure. I think we get, in my mind, if we accept that and we accept the plan as is, we really do have to do a cost-sharing arrangement of some sort, because then this becomes the only place in the city that we're going to fix a street. I mean, this becomes our yeah. this is where we're at, and nobody ever sees a street paved or improved in the rest of the city. So that's my concern. I do, kind of jumping ahead, but dovetailing with the mayor's comments. My overall concern with the plan is that it becomes an apartment plan. That we discussed that in this state we don't build condos because we disincent the state through its tort laws, apparently. I'll take the lawyer's words for it, or word for it, that we disincent condos. So, and apartments are heavily subsidized. They can get state financing. We'll give them a tax abatement for umpteen years. That's where the demand in the market is right now. So, and I don't know that I see that much retail, or for that matter, even less push for office. So my concern, and I need those concerns allayed, that how do we prevent this from just being boy, we got a great plan, we can go 8 stories in the downtown core, and I can get subsidized money from the housing finance, and we can just start building apartments all over the town center. So I end up with 2,000 or 3,000 people in apartments that are tax-free, sitting here in the town center, and we hope that some retail will come along with it. Something more than a coffee shop, I guess. Is that? I mean, how do we, what I see is we're walking this narrow, we want to redevelop, but we're walking this narrow path that it just doesn't become a...
Well, a simple way to address that question, really on the multifamily side, is take away the tax exemption for a good portion of downtown. If that's an issue that the council has, that this becomes an apartment complex zoning district, that's one way of dealing with it. But that's something you might want to consider. I would also like to just come back to your comment, Mr. Bogie, about your thoughts that once we do this plan, we're going to spend all of our street dollars in the downtown and nowhere else. I mean, I've had conversations with the city manager about this, and that's not the intent of this plan, and that the intent of this plan is to take whatever dollars that we do have and disperse them within the downtown, but in other areas of the city as well, because there's lots of parts of the city of Lakewood that need street infrastructure. So I'm not suggesting in any way that the downtown plan is going to take away street monies for other projects. So I want to be clear with that, and that the council is going to have to decipher what it wants in its capital improvement plan, which is what you're currently doing. And as I said before, I think you're going to be spending more time on capital improvement project planning in future years, because as you wrestle with this area of the city and some of the proposals here, how to address that level of growth and development, but still be addressing the impacts of other streets in the city of Lakewood that do need improvements, that do need curb gutters and sidewalks, that do need to be paved, whatever the situation might be. There has to be a balance here. This plan is not designed, it should not be designed to take limited street dollars and just put them into downtown. I want to be clear with that. That was never what staff was talking about.
I'm not accusing staff, because this is a plan that came through the community as a whole. So, and it is a council decision as to what goes in the tip or not. So right. You are correct in that the council has the final say on where the dollars go. I'm just mentioning that, future councils may see that, and I guess that's that's up to them. But that is a concern that I have.
And if I could, Mr. Bokie, the Central Business District zoning is quoted as the primary retail, office, social, urban, residential, and government center of the city. So if this comes back within a couple of years for review and the council is seeing nothing but residential coming through, there's a way to redefine what the zone will allow. So maybe there's an update at some point to what the Central Business District can include. So again, it's a living document intended to be reviewed over time.
Mr. Benson.
Well, one of my concerns on the transportation side on the cost is the conversion of private streets to public streets. That on the chart here, it specifically shows that the conversion of Town Center Boulevard and Bristol are the two significant ones that are going into the cost calculation. But we have a map that shows lots of other little yellow lines of other streets that eventually would do that, that aren't included in the 42 million. And that's a extremely costly percentage of the total transportation cost. 59th Avenue, which is 3.5 blocks. That is the most expensive 3.5 block transportation project since we became a city. That conversion of that to do that. I mean, we still haven't even paid for that yet. And we've got outstanding debt to cover that. And when I look at Bristol being one of the two prime streets that we want to do that, Bristol is not intended to be a part of the Green Street Loop, which is a big positive piece of this plan. But Bristol, when I look at Bristol, 2 blocks of Bristol runs between the back of existing buildings. It's essentially an alley. It's a pretty well paved alley, but it's an alley, okay? And then there's a block that runs between 2 parking lots, and then there's a half block that then runs between the sides of 2 established buildings to be able to go and do that. You know, the conversion of that to the advantages of converting to public streets, in general was first of all said, downtowns in lots of other cities all have good grid-type street networks. Well, a lot of that's because they started with grid streets, and that's where they're at. I mean, we're Lakewood. We have a downtown that has certain of those things that I can see, like converting Bristol and to a lesser extent, I'm concerned about Lakewood Town Center Boulevard, because Lakewood Town Center Boulevard at least has potential as a bicycle, non-motorized path if you build it up and buy it and put sidewalks on one side, similar to what we're doing on Gravelly Lake Drive, which is what sort of the plan is outlining, that very wide sidewalk on one side to be able to go and do that. But it's still a whole street that's running between parking lots that are owned by folks who are happy the way things are because they're making money and they have made commitments to all of their tenants that parking is going to stay there. So the plan to privatize that and then build that into the cost that we're going to charge developers 50% of doing seems, you know, far more expensive. And if you took those 2 elements out of this, Bristol and that out, that 42 million goes down more to 30.
I'm sorry.
Throw the slide up in the streets just so I can get
Back a Safeway too. Here.
I mean,
The
the Green Street Loop is all currently public street.
See, runs between 24
That
Hour Fitness, behind Safeway, behind Burlington, behind Panda Express.
the other streets that are proposed to eventually be private but aren't included in the cost figures are in the one that runs in front of
They gave it to us.
the office
Yeah, we'd have
depot
to
and
maintain it.
things like that is really an entryway to a parking lot. The one that runs in front of Safeway and Cold Stone Creamery is essentially an entryway to a parking lot. Bristol which is one of the two streets that's included in the cost estimates, is essentially an alley for 2 blocks. It just becomes a windfall for the current owner of those streets to be able to go and do that. And certainly not privatizing Bristol and not including it in the costs that we're going to ask developers to share. Because it doesn't, some of the other impacts about privatizing streets, like it'll increase the ability to provide police patrols. I think police are able to patrol the town center adequately now. They don't, what they don't do is they don't enforce certain traffic laws on the private streets. But in terms of public safety, they're responsive and do that. So I'd like to see that piece. If maybe it is in a long-term strategy, is still in the plan, but I'd really like to see it taken out of the cost calculations that we're going to charge developers for those two projects. And if we decide that we want to invest in I don't know that we got to privatize Lakewood Town Center Boulevard to put a sidewalk and a trail along next to it. Yeah.
Taking Town Center and Bristol, that saves us $13 million.
18, 19.
Yeah. I think that was about 10 million for that part of the transportation plan. I don't have the chart with the numbers on it, because the chart I got is only lists the projects and a total number. It doesn't have the numbers.
11,757, I think, for conversion of Lakewood Town Center Boulevard, and 7,357 for conversion of Bristol. So those two together are over 19 million dollars.
Yeah, from an economic standpoint, you should give it to us if we'll take care of it.
That's the other part of this, is when they come in with a proposed development project, the city is most likely going to be requesting that be a part of a dedication. And that it does become a public street, and the city of Lakewood does put in the improvements, and then we have an 8-foot wide sidewalk on both sides, and then now we're creating a real type of commercial downtown that's walkable, and we're talking about placemaking once again. But the number is in there to give you an idea of the fact of how much this stuff costs, because it goes back to the fact that in the downtown, the city of Lakewood has a dearth of lack of infrastructure that you normally would find in a downtown. And we're totally beholden to the private side to provide for the majority of the streets within the town center per se. And in 2002, 2003 was the city's first take at trying to grab some right-of-way, if you will, when they were redeveloping the right-of-way. That's how the city of Lakewood got Main Street, and that's how the city of Lakewood got 59th as public rights-of-way. And then all these private roads that you see behind buildings and things of that nature, while they were private and we were not able to get them to agree to a public dedication, they did agree to build them to city standards. So many of those roads are already currently built to city standards, but they're not dedicated to the city.
But they didn't dedicate us 59th, they sold us 59th,
That's
and we paid millions for it.
And that was also, I believe, as I recall, a part of the deal with the City Hall project too.
So a big part of the cost with privatizing, in the estimates that are going into the developer calculations, are purchasing those streets.
That's a good part of the cost, because land is not cheap.
So if there is big redevelopment, there is going to be a traffic problem, because Maine out here, just in the improvements that have been made, the addition of a few restaurants changed how traffic moves on this part of Main Street. So the streets are really designed to be mall driving, really, Main and for that matter, even 59th. So if we weren't gonna go any deeper into trying to get more streets, I mean, entrance, if we got real redevelopment, let's say right here in the middle, let's say right across the street, and entrance and egress becomes, I think, an issue, right? I mean, we can go out the back of Maine. I don't know, I'm not a traffic engineer, nor am I good at foreseeing this, but, you know, maybe there's a compromise there between taking those two streets, which are gonna be very, very expensive, but somehow improving it.
And also just remind the council, this is a 20-plus year plan, so we're all trying to think big here as well as, and not take away opportunities.
Maybe the entrance by Avondale, because at some point, by Red Robin there.
No, there's.
Because at some point that would need a light.
That's a part of this plan, I believe, is the construction of a new light at Avondale. And I think you've placed something up on the overhead here.
Well, this is from an earlier presentation provided to the council. So these are the costs broken down by project proposed. The total cost is that first column of numbers. So the first three are the ones you've been talking about, the Gravelly Lake revision, and then the conversion of Lakewood Town Center Boulevard and Bristol Avenue as public streets. If you were to go and break down the cost versus right-of-way, you see for Gravelly Lake, the construction is far more than right-of-way acquisition. There in that table. Well, if you look at Town Center, they're about the same actually, so right-of-way and construction costs are about the same. And then Bristol Avenue, again, they're about the same.
6.5.
So I think it would be fair to say that the majority of those costs that are included in your table are the improvements that would be required to bring them to the standards anticipated in the downtown plan. Yes, there's the acquisition cost, and maybe that goes down or goes away with negotiations with the private owners at this point, but a significant amount of that's going to be just the improvements made once the city owns them.
I'd also like just to point out to the council, some of the questions have been very good questions about mixed-use streets, retail streets, and so forth. And we've been playing around with the code while you guys have been asking questions and talking amongst yourselves. You could have a mixed retail street, and if you wanted to, just have retail development on the first floor and no residential uses above. Or you could have retail on the first floor and office on the second floor and no residential uses above. Or you could just have offices if you wanted to. So the whole issue of apartment complexes and things of that nature are really going to be dictated by market. So I wanted to be very clear, but you know, the multifamily tax exemption program does provide opportunities to change the market if that's something that the council's interested in. And so I just point that's out there if you want to change it, if that's an issue for the council. I know that's kind of separate from the downtown plan, but it's come up several times.
Can you incentivize development by differentiating housing, office, retail on your 50-64 lists?
That could get very complicated, Mr. Whalen.
This isn't?
Potentially you could though, yes. I mean, the council could decide that for commercial uses, the split's 50-50. For residential uses, the split's 60-40. For industrial, it's the same as one of those or something different. Yes, you could do that. And then when they do their math, it's a couple more multiplication numbers rather than the one, yeah.
But that's, if you're looking at a way of incentivizing commercial office development, that's the way to do it because you're getting more of a break than if you propose residential.
Yes. And the only limit, if you want to call it that, is in alternative 2, the maximum that could be assessed for anything out of the project share to the private side is that 70%. That's the SEPA mandated limit that you could do, 61% under modified alternative 1. But it sounds like with the discussion of the council, that's not an issue. The issue is more what's the max that you're gonna go, and it would be something other than those two numbers.
The feeling I got is that we've got more work to do. Yeah, I mean, this is 20 years.
We're certainly not pushing the council on this. It's really at your discretion, so we want to make sure you're comfortable with what we're proposing.
I don't have the feeling anybody's comfortable right now.
If what I've heard so far this evening is that the council is, okay with option 2 as far as the Colonial Plaza. Option 3, excuse me. I'm sorry, I apologize. And that with some sort of development incentive whereby transportation in lieu fees would be reduced at some fraction. No architectural review committee. The mayor wanted some additional information on the comparison of cost of retail versus office versus residential.
Cost of construction, cost of the application. Cost of the application. I guess we can pass on that.
Okay.
I got back the envelope calculation.
Okay. All right. There was some discussion that the level of cost of the number of capital improvements was over the top. Those are my words. Was some feeling that Bristol may not be a part of the plan. That was coming from Mr. Brandstetter because of its cost. Mr. Boki was concerned about this becoming an apartment plan. And staff came back and said you can do a variety of different use types within these different types of streets. So I'm not that concerned that this is that apartment plan, but in addition to protect the plan from an overabundance of higher density dwelling type uses, the council was talking about some sort of split on transportation in lieu fees.
Yes, and can I ask you a question? Yeah. So as I'm sitting here today, let's assume we decided to take Bristol off from that, which may or may not be a problem because it might cut the whole plan with these guys and we paid a bunch of money to look at them. Be that as it may. If it's in the plan and developer A and B come in and they get excited, they start doing their development and we pony up the share from them as part of their application fee, they pony in the 50%, whatever it is. That thing doesn't get done for 7 to 10 years, let's just say. And then all of a sudden we are successfully able to negotiate something with the town center, dedicate that as part of any sort of development that the town center owners may wish to do. Meanwhile, developers A, B, C, and D have ponied up money into this pot. Do they get rebated if the cost structure is something different later down the road than was contemplated when they were assessed? Or how do we accommodate that?
That is up to the council. That's a policy question. Under RCW 8202 for impact fees, which is not what these are, there is a requirement to refund if not used within 10 years. And your code currently has that, your Lakewood Municipal Code, on the park side. After 5 years, it has to go back. For the SEPA mitigation fees, there is no requirement that you refund them ever, either in part or in full. It's a decision for the council to make if you want to do that or not. The way this is drafted right now, it does suggest a refund after 10 years to be consistent with what you do under 8202. Yeah, but that is up to you. That's a decision to take up if you wish and decide if you want to do that as well.
I would just get chapped if I put a bunch of money into this developer and nothing ever happened.
Back to Mr. Buer, do you have more to your sum of that?
I'm sorry?
Is there more to your sum?
No, I didn't get, that's as far as I got. I'm also of the opinion that you would like to take a look at some very specific examples and kind of run you through a process.
Yeah. From the 50,000 foot level, I've heard comments attributed to folks in Seattle and the SRC that I believe. But basically, we get Craig's, Pierce County gets warehouses and low-income housing. cheaper housing, it's for service workers, and we'll run buses up the freeway to get them to work and attribute that to their share of sound transit money. And give them warehouses, because they got space, and we get the credits. And so, I view long-term development through that mirror. Share some of Mr. Volpe's concern that we just don't want to be apartment central for the next 25 years. I look through that lens every time we talk about development.
When we developed our vision a number of years ago, one of the elements of what people in the community did not want to see was more apartments, very emphatically. We had our share. Replacing old ones with new ones is okay, but not focused on more.
So, you've got some guidance, more to come.
Do you wish, Mr. Mayor, to talk at all about the park funding tonight, or we can put this off to the next one?
That's
Okay.
another subject is a good break.
Okay. Then the last thing I would throw at you, and I know you want to stop, is these are the big questions for you to be getting ready to decide as you're going to eventually come to action point. Which alternative do you prefer? Those staff suggested amendments from the 2 letters from Commissioner Guerrero, the idea of putting the fees into the master fee schedule, if there's any amendments to the packet itself, all those pieces, and then that transportation share you've been talking about.